Abdul Hamid had lived a long, full life, but lately, every day felt longer than the last. At 79 years old, he spent most of his time alone in his old, two-story house, tucked away in a quiet corner of Dhaka. Once, the house had been filled with laughter, with the smell of spicy curry wafting through the air and the clatter of tiny feet rushing up and down the stairs. Those were the days when his children were young, his wife Roshan Ara still alive, and every room in the house had a story to tell. Now it was different. Roshan Ara had passed away the year before, leaving behind a silence so heavy that sometimes it felt like the walls themselves were mourning her absence. His children, all grown up, had long since moved abroad, Canada, Australia, America, chasing dreams that had taken them far from the crumbling front porch of their childhood home. They called sometimes. They sent money sometimes. They cared. Of course, they cared. But caring over video calls and emails could never fill the empty chair by the window where Roshan Ara used to sit, knitting sweaters and humming old songs. Every morning, Abdul Hamid woke before dawn. The habits of a lifetime, refusing to fade, he would pray in the early light, then make himself a modest breakfast. 2 pieces of toast, 1 boiled egg, and a cup of strong black tea. After that, he would sit on the veranda, the cane chair creaking slightly under his weight, and watch the world wake up around him. Sometimes, his old friend Mokbul would come by, dragging his tired legs and a stool to sit and chat about the old days. But lately, Mokbul had been ill, and the conversations had become fewer, the silences longer. It wasn't just loneliness, it was a kind of fading, like a painting left too long in the sun, its colours slowly draining away. With his 80th birthday approaching, Abdul Hamid prepared himself for another quiet day. He didn't expect a party. He didn't expect visitors. Maybe, if he was lucky, there would be a phone call, a few words of congratulations, a promise to visit soon. He didn't blame anyone. Life had its ways of pulling people apart, scattering them like leaves in the wind. Still, a small stubborn part of him, the part that remembered birthdays filled with laughter and surprises, held on to a tiny sliver of hope. Maybe this year would be different. Maybe. The day before his birthday, the air in Dhaka was thick with the scent of impending rain. The skies were heavy, grey like old ash. Abdul Hamid sat in his usual spot by the window, watching the slow, deliberate march of time through the world outside. Children in school uniforms splashed through puddles. Rickshaw pullers covered their heads with plastic sheets, and vendors shouted to sell their last mangoes before the downpour began. Inside, his house was a world apart, silent, still, almost untouched by the life bustling just beyond its doors. Abdul Hamid pulled the old quilt tighter around his shoulders, even though it wasn't cold. There was comfort in the familiar weight, the scent of old cotton and memories. He looked at the photograph on the wall, a family portrait from 20 years ago. Roshan Ara stood tall beside him, wearing her favorite blue sari. Their 3 children smiled wide, arms thrown around each other. The younger version of himself, robust and proud, stared back at him from behind glass, a relic of a different era. He closed his eyes, letting the memories wash over him. He remembered the birthdays when Roshan Ara would bake a cake from scratch, sometimes lopsided, always delicious. The smell of vanilla and butter would fill the house. The children would hang crooked streamers across the living room, singing off-key at the top of their lungs. There would be gifts, handmade cards, clumsily wrapped books, a new prayer cap, a knitted sweater. He remembered the laughter most of all, that golden sound that filled every empty corner of the house. A knock at the door pulled him from his reverie. Startled, Abdul Hamid shuffled to the door, adjusting his glasses. Standing outside was a young delivery boy, soaked from the rain, holding a small brown parcel. "Parcel for Mr. Abdul Hamid," the boy said, grinning widely. Abdul Hamid signed for the package and took it inside. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the box. Inside was a simple, elegant card. In gold lettering, it read, "Happy 80th birthday, Baba. A little surprise is on its way. We love you." Tears blurred his vision. They remembered. They hadn't forgotten. He sat back in his chair, holding the card against his chest, feeling the warmth spread through him. For the first time in months, he smiled. A real smile. Not the polite, empty kind he wore for the world. What could the surprise be? Another package? A phone call? He didn't know. But for the first time in a long while, he felt something stir inside him. A spark of excitement. A flicker of anticipation. Tomorrow was going to be different. Tomorrow, something beautiful was coming, and he would be ready. The night before, his birthday, Abdul Hamid found it difficult to sleep. He lay in bed, listening to the soft drum of rain against the windows, the occasional rumble of distant thunder. Memories floated through his mind, of birthdays long past, of Roash and Ara's laughter, of the children's shrieks of joy as they unwrapped presents. He clutched the card tightly in his hand as he drifted into a restless sleep. A small smile playing on his lips. Somewhere deep in the folds of his dreams, he heard a door creak open, the soft patter of feet, and a warm, familiar voice whisper, "Happy birthday, Baba." The morning of his 80th birthday dawned soft and golden. The storm had passed, leaving the world fresh and clean, as if washed anew. Abdul Hamid woke early, his heart lighter than it had been in years. He took extra care in dressing, putting on his best white kurta, combing his thinning hair neatly, even dabbing a little cologne behind his ears. Just like he used to when he and Roash and Ara would go visiting. The house still felt empty, but the emptiness didn't weigh so heavily today. Today, it was filled with possibilities. He waited by the window, the card propped up beside him, watching the street outside. Hours passed. The street grew busier, then quieter again. The sun climbed higher. Still he waited, patient and hopeful. And then, just as the clock struck 2 in the afternoon, a small blue car pulled up in front of his gate. Abdul Hamid's heart leapt into his throat. The driver got out, a young woman in a green uniform, and from the back seat, she lifted a small, wriggling bundle of fur. Confused, Abdul Hamid stood up, clutching the edge of the window for support. The woman walked up to his door and rang the bell. When he opened it, she smiled warmly and placed the bundle in his arms. It was a puppy, a golden retriever, its fur soft and warm, its big brown eyes staring up at him with unfiltered love. Around its neck was a red ribbon, and attached to it was a little note. "For all the love you gave us, here's someone to love you back every day. Happy birthday, Baba. We love you." The puppy licked his chin, and Abdul Hamid laughed, a sound so full and rich that even the crows perched on the electric wires outside seemed to pause and listen. He cradled the puppy against his chest, feeling its tiny heartbeat against his own. In that moment, surrounded by the scent of wet earth and new beginnings, Abdul Hamid realized something profound. Life didn't end with loneliness. Sometimes it began again, in the form of small warm miracles that fit perfectly in your arms. The tiny golden puppy wriggled happily in Abdul Hamid's arms, its soft, wet nose nuzzling against the folds of his kurta. For a moment, Abdul Hamid simply stood there at the doorway, overwhelmed, feeling the warm, living weight of the creature pressed against him. After so many months, years perhaps, something had returned to his home. Not just a pet, not just a surprise, but life itself. The delivery woman smiled kindly. "He needs a name, sir," she said, watching the puppy lick Abdul Hamid's chin again. "A name?" Abdul Hamid murmured. He looked down into the puppy's bright, eager eyes and saw nothing but pure, unconditional love staring back at him. A name came to his lips before he even realized it. "Shondi," he whispered. It meant bond, a connection. The woman smiled wider. "Beautiful name," she said, tipping her cap before walking back to her car and driving away, leaving Abdul Hamid and Shondi standing together at the threshold of a brand new chapter. Inside, everything felt different. The old house that had for so long echoed with silence, now reverberated with the pitter-patter of tiny paws, the excited yips and whimpers of exploration. Shondi wasted no time claiming his new home, nosing into corners, sniffing the legs of chairs, chasing the lazy dust motes dancing in the afternoon sunlight. Abdul Hamid followed him slowly, laughing at the puppy's clumsy enthusiasm. He hadn't laughed like that in years. The sound surprised even him. Rusty and hoarse, but genuine. He fetched an old wicker basket from the attic, lined it with one of Rawashan Ara's soft shawls, and made a cozy little bed for Shondi next to his own. As evening fell, Abdul Hamid prepared his usual simple dinner: rice, lentils, a bit of fried eggplant. But this time, he set a small bowl of milk on the floor, too. Shondi attacked the milk with great enthusiasm, his tiny pink tongue flicking in and out, making small splashing sounds that filled the kitchen with warmth. Abdul Hamid sat at the table, watching, his chest aching in the best way possible. "You and me, Shondi," he said softly, raising his glass of water in a toast. "From today, we start anew." The puppy looked up at him, tail wagging furiously, as if he understood every word. That night, Abdul Hamid slept better than he had in months. The house, once filled with heavy, suffocating silence, now breathed softly with the sounds of life. The gentle sighs of a sleeping puppy, the occasional scrabble of paws against the floorboards. In his dreams, Rawashan Ara appeared, smiling warmly, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. She said nothing, but in her eyes was a look of peace, of approval. When he woke at dawn, Shondi was curled against his side, a small furry heartbeat warming his ribs. Abdul Hamid lay still for a long moment, savoring the unfamiliar but welcome feeling of contentment. Today would be different. Today, and every day after. The days that followed fell into a new, gentle rhythm. Every morning after Fajr prayers, Abdul Hamid would put on his sandals and Shondi's tiny leash, and they would go for a walk through the sleepy neighborhood streets. The first few mornings were comical. Shondi, all clumsy paws and boundless curiosity, would tangle the leash around lampposts, chase butterflies, bark at passing cats, and roll gleefully in patches of grass. Abdul Hamid, patient and amused, would untangle him, dust him off, and continue on, his steps lighter than they had been in years. Neighbors began to notice. First, it was just a few nods and smiles. Then came the greetings. The fruit seller waving from his cart, the school children giggling and asking to pet Shondi, the elderly rickshaw puller who stopped to share stories of his own childhood dog. People who had once passed Abdul Hamid with little more than polite nods now stopped to chat. They asked about Shondi's name, his age, his breed. They offered advice, treats, and invitations to the little community park. It was as if Shondi had not only opened a door inside Abdul Hamid's lonely heart, but it also unlocked the tightly shut gates of the community around him. One afternoon, as they sat in the park, under the wide canopy of an ancient banyan tree, Abdul Hamid watched Shondi chase his own tail in endless circles and laughed out loud. A young woman sitting nearby smiled at him. "Your dog is very lively, uncle," she said warmly. Abdul Hamid nodded, pride swelling in his chest. "His name is Shondi," he said. "He's my birthday gift." The woman's eyes softened. "You're lucky," she said. "Not everyone gets such gifts." Abdul Hamid looked at her for a moment, then said quietly, "Neither did I, for a long time. But sometimes life saves its best gifts for later." The woman nodded thoughtfully, her own eyes shining with unshed tears. Without another word, she stood, gave him a small bow of respect, and walked away. Abdul Hamid watched her go, feeling a strange connection, an invisible thread tying them briefly together. It was a small encounter, a few words, a shared smile, but it stayed with him long after he and Shondi returned home that day. As the weeks passed, Shondi grew fast, stronger, louder, even more mischievous. He would steal Abdul Hamid's slippers, hide under the bed with them, and bark triumphantly when discovered. He would chase the sunlight across the living room, barking at patches of light that shifted and danced. He would curl up on Abdul Hamid's lap whenever he tried to read the newspaper, demanding attention with insistent nudges and puppy whines. And Abdul Hamid loved every chaotic, joyful moment of it. He began to rediscover forgotten parts of himself: patience, laughter, wonder. The simple act of caring for another living being reawakened his spirit. He started cooking slightly bigger meals, experimenting with recipes he hadn't touched in decades. He dusted off old books from the shelves and read them aloud in the evenings, with Shondi curled at his feet. He even fixed the broken swing in the backyard, just to sit on it sometimes and watch the sunset. Shondi sprawled beside him. One evening, as they sat together in the growing twilight, Abdul Hamid found himself speaking aloud. "You know, Shondi," he said, his voice low and thoughtful, "I used to think my life was winding down, like a clock, ticking its last minutes. But you've shown me that maybe there's still time. Still, stories left to live." The puppy looked up at him, wagging his tail as if in agreement. Abdul Hamid chuckled. "Maybe, just maybe," he said, scratching behind Shondi's ears. "This is just the beginning." In the sky above, the first stars began to appear, tiny pinpricks of hope piercing the darkness. And in Abdul Hamid's heart, a new promise was born, not of endings, but of beginnings, of fresh journeys yet to unfold. Together they would face them, an old man and his dog, one paw step, one heartbeat, one precious day at a time. Spring came quietly to the small town, like a gentle secret whispered on the breeze. The trees outside Abdul Hamid's home began to blush with tender new leaves, and the streets filled with the scent of blooming jasmine. Inside the little yellow house at the corner of Shorot Avenue, life moved in a gentle rhythm. A man and his dog, companions, friends, family. Every morning, Shondi would nudge Abdul Hamid awake with cold, wet kisses, demanding their daily walk. And every morning, Abdul Hamid would laugh, stretch his stiff limbs, and thank the heavens for another day. There were harder days too. Days when his knees ached too much, or when he missed Roshan Ara so deeply that it hurt to breathe. But even on those days, Shondi was there, a soft paw on his lap, a head resting against his thigh, a living reminder that love, once planted, could blossom again and again. One particular morning, Abdul Hamid woke feeling unusually tired. The early sunlight slanted across the floor, and the smell of fresh earth drifted in through the open window. Shondi, sensing something different, stayed close. His usual playful energy replaced by quiet watchfulness. Abdul Hamid smiled at him. "Not today, my boy," he said softly. "Let's have an easy morning." They sat together on the back porch, watching the world stir to life. The neighbor's rooster crowing, children laughing on their way to school, the soft rustle of the trees. Abdul Hamid's heart was full, and for once, it wasn't with grief. It was with peace. A quiet, complete peace that came from knowing he had loved deeply and had been loved in return. He thought about Roash and Ara, about the years they had shared. He thought about the lonely years after her death and about the unexpected miracle of Shondi's arrival. He realized something profound. Life didn't always give you what you asked for. Sometimes it gave you something better, something you didn't even know you needed. Later that afternoon, Abdul Hamid made a decision. He rummaged through an old trunk in the attic, pulling out dusty photo albums, yellowed with age, photos of his youth, of his wedding, of family gatherings filled with laughter and clinking tea glasses. He smiled as he flipped through the pages, the memories blooming fresh in his mind. He picked out a few of his favorites. One of Roashan, Ara smiling shyly under a flowered scarf, one of himself holding a kite high above a rooftop, and one of them together on a faded green bicycle. He placed the photographs carefully into a small leather-bound book, a new album he had bought at the local market. On the first page, he wrote, "For all the days we loved, and all the days yet to come." He placed the album on the living room table beside a small bowl of fresh marigolds. Then he called Shondi over. "Come, my boy," he said, patting the floor beside him. "Let's take a picture together." With a little help from the neighbor's daughter, a bright-eyed teenager who often dropped by to check on him, they posed for a photo. Abdul Hamid sitting in his favorite chair, Shondi perched proudly on his lap, both of them looking straight at the camera. Later, when the picture was printed, he placed it on the last page of the album, the final chapter, and the beginning of many more. As summer deepened, Abdul Hamid and Shondi became a familiar sight. Around town, children would call out to them from playgrounds, tossing sticks for Shondi to chase. Shopkeepers would keep scraps of meat and sweet biscuits ready whenever Abdul Hamid came by. Old friends, once estranged by years of silence, started dropping by for evening chats, sitting on the porch with cups of steaming tea. One evening, as they sat watching the sunset, Abdul Hamid turned to Shondi. "You've changed everything, you know," he said, scratching behind the dog's ears. "You've brought her back to me, not in flesh, but in spirit. Through you, I remember what it feels like to love freely, to laugh without reason, to hope without fear." Shondi thumped his tail on the floor, his eyes gleaming with affection. Abdul Hamid leaned back and closed his eyes, letting the sounds of life, laughter, birdsong, distant music wash over him. For the first time in many, many years, he didn't fear the future. He welcomed it. Whatever came, he knew he wouldn't face it alone. Time, as it always does, continued its patient march. One crisp autumn morning, Abdul Hamid didn't wake at his usual time. Shondi, concerned, whined softly and nuzzled at his hand. When he didn't stir, the little dog let out a low, mournful howl that echoed through the house. Neighbors came quickly, called the doctor, called the police, but by then, Abdul Hamid had already embarked on his final journey. Peaceful, smiling, a book of memories by his side, and Shondi curled protectively against him. The whole town mourned. Not just for the man who had lived a full, quiet life, but for the story he had embodied, one of grief, of resilience, of unexpected second chances. At his small funeral, the community gathered, old friends, curious children, kind neighbors. They told stories of his kindness, his laughter, his love for Roashan Ara, and most of all, his bond with Shondi. Someone hung the photo of Abdul, Hamid and Shondi by the gates of the little cemetery. A smiling man, an eager dog, and between them, the invisible thread of unconditional love. Shondi was not left alone. The young woman from the park, the one who had once shared a knowing smile with Abdul Hamid, took him in. She lived just down the street in a cozy apartment filled with books and plants. Shondi adjusted quickly, his heart large enough to love again, just as his old master had taught him. Every evening, they would walk past Abdul Hamid's house. Sometimes, Shondi would tug gently at the leash, pulling towards the porch, sniffing at the door, tail wagging expectantly. And every time the woman would kneel, wrap her arms around him and whisper, "He's watching, my brave boy. He's proud of you. And he loves you still." The golden puppy, who had once been a surprise gift, became a guardian of memories, a carrier of love that refused to die in the gentle rhythm of everyday life. In walks beneath the banyan tree, in laughter shared over tea, in the simple act of sitting quietly at sunset. Abdul Hamid lived on, not just in memory, but in every heartbeat, every paw step, every moment when love chose to bloom again.